Hi, guys. Tonight we wander into the kind of darkness that makes your breath look like smoke and your eyelashes freeze together if you blink too slowly. You imagine stepping out into a world so still, the air itself feels alive, whispering in the timbers of an old cabin. Tonight, we talk about cold and about the people who knew it better than any of us ever will. The pioneers, the settlers, the wanderers who slept beneath frost-covered rafters and woke up surrounded by silence so thick it felt like a wall. You probably wouldn't survive this, not without a dozen gadgets and a pile of fleece, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now dim the lights. You trudge through the brittle snow, every step making a sound like crushed sugar. The horizon is a pale stripe between black trees and gray sky. There's no traffic hum, no electric buzz, just the whisper of wind and the creak of frozen leather. This is how the pioneers began their mornings, measuring survival by the sharpness of air in their lungs. When they said it was biting cold, they meant it literally. Skin cracked, lips split, and the smallest mistake, a wet mitten, a lost ember, could end a life by dawn. Still, they adapted. You can picture an early settler kneeling beside a fire pit, palms hovering over the thin blue flame. He knows the difference between a cold that means bundle tighter and a cold that means move the livestock. Now their senses tuned to frost the way modern ears tune to traffic. Historians still argue whether this sensitivity came from constant exposure or a cultural reverence for weather itself. Some call it instinct born of necessity. Others say it was spiritual, a way of listening to the world. What's undeniable is that pioneers read the air like a book. They watched the way smoke hung low or drifted high, the way breath lingered or how snowflakes clung to wool. If the flakes were soft and dry, the day would stay bitter but still. If they were sticky and heavy, a storm was brewing. You might think of this as folk superstition, but modern meteorologists admit these observations were remarkably accurate. It wasn't science in the academic sense, it was survival science. The quirky part? Many pioneers carried tiny bits of metal, sometimes keys or spoons in their pockets, not for luck, but as impromptu thermometers. A sudden sting of cold metal against the skin told them how low the temperature had dropped. They didn't need a mercury column to know when it was time to bank the fire higher. It's the kind of small practical intelligence that rarely makes it into textbooks, but built entire generations of resilience. As night fell, the world transformed. You imagine lying under layers of rough wool, your nose the only part of you brave enough to face the air. The cabin groans, boards tightening in the freeze. Outside, frost grows like lace across the window, its patterns beautiful and menacing. Inside, every sound becomes sharper. Even the silence has texture, like a sheet being pulled tight over the earth. You start to realize the cold isn't just absence of warmth, it's a living presence. The pioneers knew that. They treated it with the respect due a wild animal. They didn't try to conquer it so much as negotiate with it. Keep your fire small enough to conserve fuel, large enough to keep the wolves at bay. Keep your windows sealed, but not too tight, or you'll suffocate by morning. Life balanced on inches of logic. One mainstream historical fact tells us that by the early 1800s, settlers in North America often began winter preparations as early as August. The cutting of firewood, curing of meats, and sealing of homes were community rituals, not chores. It was said that a man's worth could be measured by how neatly his woodpile was stacked before the first frost. Today, you might measure your readiness by how many nights you could face the silence unafraid. But to them, it was how many nights you could face the silence unafraid. And here's a quieter truth. Many of those nights were peaceful, with no engines, no distant rumble of civilization. Cold brought stillness that bordered on holiness. You'd sit by the dim fire and listen to the timber walls expand and contract. Some settlers describe hearing stars crackle on the coldest nights, an illusion caused by frost splitting bark and ice crystals catching sound in the still air. You lean closer to that thought. Imagine lying there, wrapped in rough blankets, staring at the flicker of flame reflected in a tin cup, the sound of your own heartbeat mixing with the hiss of embers. There's no rush to check the time, no urge to fill the quiet. The pioneers lived inside that rhythm, where every minute stretched into calm endurance. Historians still debate whether those early communities thrived because they were tougher, or simply more attuned to discomfort. Maybe both. They accepted hardship as a language. Cold spoke, and they listened. We, on the other hand, insulate ourselves until silence becomes foreign. The idea of hearing snowfall feels almost mythical. But for them, it was just another night, a night where survival and serenity shared the same bed. The frost outside would draw filigree on the window, and by morning the pioneers would read it like scripture, checking where the ice had thickened, where cracks had formed. To them, cold was not an enemy, it was a teacher, and its lessons began with stillness. You close your eyes and let that sink in. The breath you exhale fogs into the air, ghosting away like a memory. The first lesson of cold isn't about fire or fear. It's about listening. Listening so deeply that you can feel the air's edge against your skin and know exactly what it's telling you. The pioneers understood that better than we ever will. And tonight you begin to remember. You wake to the sound of something gentle and alive. Not the wind exactly, but the shifting breath of a fire that never truly sleeps. The pioneers called it their night companion. In the deep freeze of early winters, that small flame was the difference between comfort and calamity. You imagine crouching near a rough-hewn hearth, its stones blackened by years of smoke. The air tastes faintly of ash, dry wood, and a trace of iron from the kettle hung above the embers. In that world, a fire was not an object. It was a living creature, a friend with moods and needs. You had to tend it like a child or a stubborn animal. Let it starve, and you risked frost creeping in before dawn. Feed it too much, and you'd waste precious wood or risk setting your cabin alight. You can picture a woman in a heavy wool skirt, half asleep, stirring the coals with a poker carved from iron. Her hand moves without thinking, guided by the whispering logic of experience. Historians still argue whether this constant vigilance was a conscious tradition or a habit born from necessity. There are diaries from prairie wives and homesteaders that mention listening to the fire breathe, a poetic description, but also literal. When the flames sighed unevenly, it meant the oxygen inside the cabin was low or the wood was too damp. Those subtle sounds could save a life. The mainstream historical fact is that settlers often kept fires burning for months without ever letting them die out completely. In regions of Northern Europe and early America, a household flame was passed from one generation to another. When families moved west, they sometimes carried a small ember wrapped in moss or a hollowed-out horn, preserving their home flame like a relic. To them, relighting a fire from scratch was a dangerous gamble in freezing wind. That ember represented continuity, warmth, even divine protection. You crouch closer to imagine it. The glow pulses in the dark, breathing softly against the cold air that sneaks through every crack. Sparks leap upward, orange and defiant, while shadows dance across log walls. Outside, the world is a mirror of ice and stars. Yet inside this small space, there is movement, color, life.
The quirky detail that still surprises people is how some settlers used potato slices or dough to seal gaps around the hearth. They would smear them into cracks where cold air seeped, letting the starch harden into makeshift insulation. Others burned dung, peat, or even dried seaweed when wood was scarce. The smell was terrible, but warmth was warmth. You might wrinkle your nose, but if you'd been out there long enough, it would smell like safety itself. To a pioneer, the fire's glow was also a clock. Before dawn, the last red heart of the flame told you how many hours of sleep you had left. Children learned early how to read that fading light. If the coals glowed dull orange, it was near morning. If they were gray and whispering, it was time to rise and rekindle before frost reached the bedding. Sometimes you wonder if they ever truly rested. The answer lies in how they designed their lives. The fire's heartbeat shaped their nights, and the rhythm of tending it became as natural as breathing. No one complained. They knew that losing vigilance meant inviting death. Yet even in that constant labor, there was peace. The work gave the darkness a pattern, a purpose. There's something oddly calming about that idea. Waking every few hours to stir, to feed, to keep something alive. In modern life, you wake to alarms and notifications. Back then, it was the soft murmur of embers, reminding you that warmth was earned, not automatic. It makes you think about how convenience numbed our instincts. You flick a switch and heat appears, but you no longer feel the pulse of it. One old settler journal describes a night when the fire died. The writer recalls waking to a silence so complete it hurt. He had to trudge through knee-deep snow to the neighbor's cabin, carrying a tin lantern. The neighbor shared a glowing coal from his hearth, carried back in a hollowed turnip. That's how communities bonded, through shared heat, not small talk. Fire connected people before electricity connected wires. Historians still debate whether these customs of shared flame came from pagan rituals or simple practicality. Either way, the symbolism lingered. To give someone fire was to give them life. To refuse it was an act of hostility. In many pioneer towns, the communal bonfire was a social glue where gossip, prayer, and laughter mingled with the scent of sap and smoke. You picture the scene. The snow reflects the orange glow of the flames, and faces gather close, half hidden by wool scarves. The sound of cracking pine fills the still air. Someone hums a hymn. Someone else tells a story about frost spirits. Even skeptics listened, because in that endless white, imagination was as necessary as fuel. A modern scientist might point out that the radiant heat of a fire doesn't just warm bodies, it alters mood. The steady flicker stimulates relaxation responses, lowers heart rate, and slows thought. Pioneers didn't have the vocabulary for neurochemistry, but they knew its truth in their bones. They called it peace fire, a word that shows up in letters from Scandinavian immigrants. The longer you stare into that imagined fire, the more it feels alive. You sense how fragile yet enduring that warmth must have seemed in the dead of winter. The pioneers didn't simply burn wood, they burned anxiety, loneliness, and fear. Every pop of the flame was a small defiance against the void outside. So you sit with them for a while, in your mind, feeling the quiet contentment of people who earn their comfort one ember at a time. The fire shifts, sighs, and stretches. Someone stirs, pulls a blanket tighter. The night carries on, the flame breathing softly, never truly asleep. You wake before sunrise, wrapped in layers that scratch, itch, and smell faintly of smoke. The cold presses in from every wall, but you are still alive, cocooned in the ancient logic of fabric and instinct. The pioneers understood that warmth was not a luxury, it was an art form. Every thread, every seam, every layer mattered. Wool, linen, hide, and fur, These were the original survival technologies, long before synthetic fibers and heated jackets. A record from early frontier diaries notes that settlers often began dressing for winter in October, stacking garments like armor. First came a linen shirt, then a wool vest, then a hide jerkin, and finally a great coat heavy enough to stand upright on its own. Each layer trapped air, the invisible insulation that made the difference between shivering and sleeping. They didn't think in Celsius or Fahrenheit, they thought in breaths and heartbeats. Could you feel your fingertips? Could you breathe through the scarf without icing your lashes? That was their weather report. It's easy to imagine the sensory world of those clothes, the squeak of frozen leather, the soft crackle of wool stiff with frost, the faint animal musk of a fur collar. Each garment carried the memory of the creature it came from, and that connection mattered. Settlers would speak of a living warmth, a belief that wearing hide or fur retained the spirit of the creature's endurance. Whether or not that was true, the psychology of it gave strength when temperatures sank below human comfort. One curious detail tucked into old letters tells of settlers using newspaper as an extra layer beneath their clothing. The ink smudged their skin, but the paper trapped heat surprisingly well. Some even stuffed straw or dried grass between shirts and coats, creating a rustling temporary padding. It was noisy, awkward, and utterly effective. Survival rarely looks elegant. Researchers today still discuss how pioneers managed moisture control without modern waterproofing. The answer lies in rhythm. They learned not to overheat. Sweat was an enemy, freezing quickly and stealing body heat. To stay alive, you learn to move at the pace of endurance, not speed. Trappers and explorers practiced cold breathing, inhaling through scarves to warm air before it hit their lungs. Simple habits born of necessity now echo in survival training manuals. Clothing was also a form of communication. The patch on a sleeve, the way a hat brim curled, each told a story of region, skill, and status. A well-mended coat was a badge of respect. A woman's layered skirts revealed her resourcefulness more than her fashion.
Buttons were rare and precious. Some were made from carved bone, others from coins or polished wood. If one fell off, it was retrieved, even from the snow. Nothing was wasted. Imagine the evening scene. A family by the firelight, the mother darning wool stockings, children rubbing tallow into boots to keep out moisture. The smell of lanolin fills the air, sticky and earthy. Outside, the wind howls against the shutters, but inside, hands move with quiet purpose. These were not just chores, they were nightly rituals of survival. One overlooked account from the Northern Territories describes frost-walking suits, outfits of layered fur and wool so thick that wearers moved like statues. People laughed at their own stiffness, calling it the bear dance. Yet those suits allowed them to endure temperatures that would paralyze most modern hikers in minutes. Humor, it seems, was another layer of insulation. Contemporary historians differ on whether early settlers truly understood the science behind insulation or simply learned through pain. Perhaps both are true. Their experiments were born from failure: the frost-bitten fingers, the cracked lips, the numb limbs. Each mistake left a mark, a lesson recorded not in books, but in scars. When a community lost someone to exposure, the story of that night became a local rule. Every tragedy taught warmth a little better. There was also pride and resilience. You can almost hear an old farmer saying, "Cold never hurt a working man, only a lazy one." It was both bravado and self-defense. Complaining about weather was a luxury they couldn't afford. To survive winter meant proving something, not just to nature, but to oneself. One more unusual fact tucked into early European journals mentions travelers who warmed themselves by carrying heated stones in their pockets, wrapped in cloth. Others filled bottles with boiling water and tucked them into their bedding, an idea that quietly evolved into the modern hot water bottle.
Even ingenuity, it seems, has ancient roots in cold nights. Imagine for a moment waking in that world. You stretch inside rough blankets, pull on frozen boots, and feel the sting as blood returns to your fingers. There is discomfort, yes, but also pride. The layers you wear are more than fabric. They are fragments of time, culture, and instinct sewn together. You understand the cold not as an enemy, but as a partner in conversation. If you listen carefully, the rustle of fabric becomes a kind of lullaby. Every sound has purpose. Every scratch and itch reminds you that life still hums beneath the frost. You can't rely on technology to keep you safe, so you rely on wisdom passed through hands, stitches, and memory. The pioneers didn't fight the cold so much as negotiate with it. They bartered sweat for survival, comfort for endurance. And in that trade, they built a knowledge we've nearly forgotten. That warmth begins not in the fire, but in the way you move, breathe, and wrap yourself against the night. You wake to a room painted in silver light. The window beside your bed has turned into a frozen mural, its surface traced with curling, feathery shapes that shimmer like the veins of leaves. You breathe out, and your breath clouds against the frost, blurring the patterns for an instant before they reappear, perfect again. The pioneers knew this site well. Frost on the window was not just decoration, it was a message. A recorded observation from early homestead journals mentions that people could read those icy designs like a map of their own homes. The thicker the frost near a seam, the worse the insulation. If the crystals were delicate and feathered, it meant slow, steady cold outside. If they formed hard spikes or sheets, a deep freeze was coming. Even children learned to watch the glass before breakfast, to know whether to fetch more firewood or thaw the pump handle before it locked solid. To you, it might look poetic, almost magical, but to a settler, it was practical art. They called it window weather. Frost windows were their barometers, their morning newspapers, and sometimes their quiet entertainment. In a world without screens or thermometers, the frozen glass was alive with meaning. One odd yet clever trick, often found in letters from the 19th century, describes pioneers rubbing raw onions or potatoes on the inside of the glass before nightfall. The faint film of starch helped reduce condensation, keeping the frost patterns thinner so light could enter. It was an early version of window insulation, born of kitchen wisdom rather than chemistry. Researchers still discuss how these early homes managed to balance air circulation and heat. Many cabins had no chimneys at first, only smoke holes. Too tight a seal and smoke suffocated the family. Too loose, and the wind stole every ember of warmth. The frost on the windows told them which way the balance was tipping. Where ice was thickest, drafts were cruelest. Some pioneers pressed rags or paper into those gaps, sealing them with tallow or beeswax. The cold shaped more than their architecture. It shaped their imagination. You can almost see a small child tracing the frost patterns with a fingertip, inventing stories from the shapes. Some families believed that the patterns were written by Jack Frost, a mischievous winter spirit. Others thought that angels had touched the glass during the night. These myths softened the hardship, turning discomfort into wonder. A curious note from a New England diary describes how a family began each morning by naming the shapes on their frozen window, the fern, the bird's wing, the waterfall, before scraping away a patch to see the world outside. That daily ritual was both necessity and poetry, a small moment of beauty carved from survival. Chroniclers of the period often mention how frost affected domestic life in subtler ways. Plates cracked if placed too close to the window. Ink froze in inkwells, thickening into sluggish black syrup.
Bread dough refused to rise. Every task became a negotiation with the cold, and every breath was visible proof of persistence. Imagine sitting by that window with a candle burning low. The flame flickers against the icy surface, reflecting in hundreds of tiny fractures. The sound of the wind outside is steady but distant, like ocean waves under snow. Inside, you feel both fragile and strong at once. The frost isolates you from the world, yet connects you to it through beauty. One overlooked detail in architectural records suggests that people used frost to judge when to mend their walls. They called it reading the house. When frost crept lower down the windows each winter, it meant the building was settling, losing its seal. It was a slow visual language of maintenance, a dialogue between human craft and nature's cold artistry. Modern scientists would describe frost as the crystallization of water vapor on glass colder than the surrounding air. But to the pioneers, it was something closer to handwriting. They said frost told on them, revealing where they had built poorly, where they had been careless with the fire, where they had slept too soundly while the cold crept in. You picture a woman in a wool shawl, breathing on her window to melt a small circle, peering out at a world blindingly white. Somewhere beyond the barn, the sun arises over frozen fields. The frost sparkles like crushed glass. And for a moment, you understand why she pauses to watch it. Even hardship can glitter if you learn how to see. A less discussed belief from that time claims that frost patterns could predict the future. Some settlers thought certain shapes meant a good harvest ahead, or the safe return of loved ones. It was a form of quiet superstition, a way of finding meaning when so much was uncertain. Scholars today still debate whether these interpretations were serious omens or simple diversions to pass the long silent nights. Regardless of belief, the frost windows became the house's diary. Each night new entries appeared, written in ice, erased by daylight, and every morning another family would wake to read the story written across their glass. You run your hand along that imaginary frost. Now it feels cold enough to sting, yet delicate enough to shatter at a touch. The pioneers lived with this fragility every day, reading beauty and danger from the same window pane. We forget that cold once had handwriting, that silence once spoke in crystal script the pioneers never did. The cabin air feels close but alive, scented with smoke, wool, and the faint sweetness of drying apples. You can hear breathing all around you, soft and steady, layered beneath the sound of logs shifting in the stove. This was the music of winter life among pioneers, a symphony of warmth made not just from fire, but from each other. The economics of body heat governed their survival. A record from mid-9th century farm accounts reveals that many families built their homes with shared sleeping quarters, not only out of modesty or space limitations, but to conserve heat. The warmth of 5 or 6 people under one low ceiling meant a fire could burn lower through the night. Heat was a currency. Bodies were its savings banks. The family's position in bed sometimes followed hierarchy: parents in the center, children at the edges, and the oldest nearest the drafty walls. You can imagine it now: quilts stitched from worn dresses, sheets thick as rugs, and the smell of human closeness impossible to forget. The pioneers did not talk about personal space. They talked about keeping their toes. One unusual domestic custom mentioned in rural diaries describes how families placed warm stones wrapped in flannel at the foot of the bed. In the morning, those same stones were dropped into buckets of cold water to keep from cracking, ready to be reheated for the next night.
Nothing went to waste. Even warmth was recycled. Architectural historians have noted that many log cabins in early prairie homes were deliberately built low and compact. The ceilings pressed down like protective hands, trapping every wisp of heat. The windows were small, often double-paned with oil paper instead of glass. The air inside stayed smoky, dense, and heavy, but it meant survival. A house too big was not impressive, it was foolish.
A curious observation preserved in a letter from a traveling preacher tells of visiting settlers who gathered to sleep in barns when storms hit. He wrote that the beasts lend their heat to the humble, and the humble give back their prayers. Sleeping near livestock was not disgraceful, it was common sense. Horses and cows radiated enough warmth to lift a room's temperature by several degrees. Modern researchers later confirmed it. The pioneers had stumbled on a living form of insulation. You notice the rhythm of breathing again in that small space. It was the heartbeat of community. Privacy was traded for survival, modesty for comfort. The crackle of fire, the sigh of the wind through chinks in the wall, and the sound of someone turning in their sleep, these were lullabies. The intimacy was not romantic, it was necessary. Contemporary scholars remain divided on whether such closeness strengthened bonds or bred tension. Some journals describe harmony and laughter, the warmth of companionship easing fear. Others record quarrels, sleepless nights, and the suffocating sense of never being alone. Yet both truths can coexist. Cold makes people honest. Another forgotten practice involved sleeping garments. Men wore long flannel shirts, often unwashed for weeks, and women slept in multiple skirts or shawls. The smell might have been thick, but clean clothes were reserved for daylight hours when they could be aired by the fire. Children were sometimes wrapped in burlap sacks filled with straw, a rough but efficient sleeping bag. It was not comfort in the modern sense, but a quiet defiance of death. You imagine morning breaking after such a night. The window glows with frost again, but the air inside has softened. The fire whispers back to life as someone blows on the coals. Blankets rustle, a baby whimpers. Someone laughs at the steam rising from a cup of weak coffee. The family begins another day bound together by warmth that was never only physical. One lesser-known fact from Scandinavian settlers tells of heat pooling, a strategy of arranging furniture so that sleeping areas were above or near the kitchen stove. They called it the warm corner, and it became both a practical and emotional center of the home. Some families decorated that area with family Bibles, heirlooms, or the few photographs they owned, as if warmth and memories shared the same space. Modern life has erased that choreography. Central heating isolates us in our own rooms, each sealed behind doors, each wrapped in individualized comfort. The pioneers would have found that strange, even sad. To them, warmth was communal. A fire that burned for one was wasted. You shift in your imagined bed and feel the presence of others nearby. The gentle movements, the shared breath. It is not claustrophobia, it is reassurance. The pioneers did not invent technology to fight the cold. They built their families to outlast it. Some anthropologists suggest that the constant nearness of others shaped how frontier societies understood kindness. When you sleep close enough to hear another person's heartbeat, cruelty has no space to grow. Maybe that is what the cold taught best. Empathy forged by necessity. As you drift in that thought, the cabin fades again into quiet. The fire hums low. The snow outside falls without sound, and all that remains is the gentle proof of life, one breath at a time. Shared warmth and a fragile peace carved from the winter. The world outside has gone perfectly white. The trees look heavy with silence, and even the sound of your boots disappears into the powder. You take a breath and it feels sharp and almost sweet, as if the air itself were alive. The pioneers knew that snow was not just a danger to endure, but a tool to use. They discovered what nature already understood. Sometimes the coldest material is also the warmest shelter.
Accounts from Arctic explorers and prairie settlers describe how snow could be shaped into protection. A drift piled against a cabin wall acted as natural insulation, blocking the wind better than boards ever could. By winter's peak, homes were half buried, and the settlers preferred it that way. The temperature inside rose several degrees, and the howling outside turned into a muffled hum. A curious note from a Canadian homestead's diary tells of families who deliberately packed snow around their roofs, calling it the white blanket. The snow froze solid overnight, sealing the rafters and keeping heat from escaping. It was counterintuitive, but effective. They learned to let the cold defend them from itself. You picture it now. A small log cabin, almost invisible under layers of snow. Smoke threading through a narrow chimney, light flickering through frosted glass. Inside it is dim and hushed. The air damp but safe. When the wind rages, the snow absorbs the fury like a quilt of silence. You feel the warmth differently. In that world, it is not comfort, but survival wrapped in stillness. An interesting practice among early trappers was the building of snow huts, temporary domes carved from packed ice. The Inuit had perfected this long before Europeans arrived, but settlers adopted the technique quickly. They discovered that the inner surface of a snow hut could reach just below freezing, while outside temperatures dropped far lower. A candle or a single person's body heat could make the difference between frostbite and rest. Some journals mentioned that when settlers traveled long distances by sleigh, they would dig shallow trenches and snowbanks and line them with evergreen branches covered with an extra layer of snow. Those makeshift shelters became warm enough to sleep in. One traveler wrote that the snow was my ceiling, my enemy turned friend. His handwriting shakes from cold, but his admiration is clear.
Modern researchers still puzzle over how quickly humans learn to trust snow, a substance both deadly and life-saving. It reflects light so fiercely that it blinds, yet it muffles sound until even fear grows quiet. Settlers came to recognize its moods. The crisp squeak of dry frost underfoot meant safety, while the sticky silence of wet snow warned of storms. There was also a spiritual side to this understanding. Some families saw snow as a purifier. They placed bowls of it near windows, letting it melt for drinking water, believing it carried freshness from the sky. Old wives' tales claimed melted snow could cleanse the body or soothe burns. One herbalist journal from 1832 speaks of using snow water in early medicine, cooled to numb pain before amputations. Primitive cryotherapy long before the word existed. Not every experience was so serene. In sudden blizzards, snow turned from ally to assassin in minutes. Whiteout conditions erased all direction. People told of walking in circles, only steps from their cabins. Some tied ropes between doors and barns so they could find their way home in zero visibility. One farmer's note says, "The world was gone and only sound remained." The sound he meant was the dull roar of wind over snow, a living heartbeat of winter. Despite the danger, snow taught pioneers patience. They learned that rushing through a storm meant death, waiting meant wisdom. The quiet enforced reflection. You can almost feel it, the sense of surrender as the flakes pile up, each one unique and yet identical, covering the harsh world in gentleness. Children, of course, loved it. They carved tunnels and forts, shaping beauty from adversity. Some adults joined them, pretending to test the snow's strength while stealing a moment of play. One lesser-known story from Wisconsin tells of a frontier pastor who built his Sunday pulpit entirely from packed snow, preaching until it melted into puddles around his boots. Faith, humor, and frost often met in the same place. Contemporary historians often differ on whether such adaptation to snow was instinctual or inherited from older European traditions. In truth, it was both. People remembered old-world customs of straw thatching and earthen insulation, then learned new lessons from the lands they claimed. The fusion of those traditions became the architecture of endurance. As night falls in your imagination, you step outside that cabin again. The snow reflects starlight so clearly it glows blue. You listen, and the world gives nothing back but silence. Every sound is distant, slowed, absorbed. You realize how fragile modern comfort feels compared to this peace. The pioneers did not fear silence. They lived inside it, knowing that beneath their frozen walls
Warmth was always waiting if they respected the cold enough to use it wisely. You kneel, press your glove into the snow, and lift a handful. It sparkles between your fingers, cold enough to burn, soft enough to melt at your touch. You begin to understand what they did.
Cold is not absence, it is the presence of something ancient, something honest. The pioneers listened and the snow listened back. The room feels alive with your own breathing. Each inhale lifts a faint mist into the dim air, a little cloud that fades before reaching the rafters. You listen not to the wind or the stove, but to that rhythm inside your chest. The pioneers paid close attention to their breath. In a world without thermostats or climate control, breath itself became a kind of weather report. A note from an 1802 homesteader's letter explains that people often judged the night's danger by how far their breath drifted before it vanished. If it lingered too long, the air inside was heavy and stale, meaning smoke and dampness were trapped. If it vanished quickly, the room was too dry and heat was escaping. Without knowing it, they were early students of condensation and airflow. Inside those log cabins, the dance between heat and moisture shaped life. Steam from cooking, sweat from labor, and the quiet breath of animals all clung to the walls and windows. On the coldest mornings, a thin glaze of ice would form inside as well as out. You can almost see it, frost growing along the ceiling beams like delicate lace, melting only when the first fire caught again. One curious entry from a frontier journal describes how settlers would sometimes hang damp cloths near their beds to catch condensation overnight. In the morning, they wrung out the water, a small way to keep humidity balanced so throats did not burn and lips did not split. They did not have words like moisture control, yet they managed it with instinct. Another practice that might sound strange to modern ears involved sleeping with mouths covered by scarves. Some pioneers called this night wrapping. The goal was simple: to warm the air before it entered the lungs, reducing the risk of coughing or frostbite on the lips. Even today, mountaineers use a similar trick. It was one of those small inherited pieces of wisdom passed between generations without fanfare. Researchers who study historical domestic life point out that pioneers unintentionally mastered what we now call passive ventilation. The cracks between logs, the uneven seams, even the gaps around windows created a slow exchange of air. It prevented suffocation and reduced mold in rooms that were otherwise sealed tight against the cold. It is a reminder that imperfection was sometimes the best design. Imagine sitting quietly in that space at night, hearing nothing but the faint drip of meltwater from the roof and the soft breathing of others nearby. There is a serenity in it, the kind of peace that comes only from rhythm and repetition. Every exhale rises, joins the low smoke near the ceiling, and becomes part of the cabin's life. A rarely mentioned belief from mountain communities claimed that the breath of sleeping people could feed the fire's spirit. Families sometimes kept an ember burning near their beds, not only for warmth, but for this symbolic exchange. The fire breathed, they breathed, and the cycle continued. Whether that was superstition or poetry hardly matters.
It gave meaning to the smallest act of survival. Modern scholars still discuss how such environments affected health. Some argue that the smoky interiors led to lung diseases, others that the constant exposure to cold, fresh air through small gaps strengthened immune systems. Perhaps both are true. In either case, the pioneers lived with a level of intimacy with air itself that we can hardly imagine. There is something deeply human about that connection. The breath fogging the window each morning reminded them they were still alive. In winter, you could see proof of existence with every exhale. Children laughed at it, pretending to puff smoke like giants. Adults found comfort in the same sight, even as their joints ached and their fingers numbed. An overlooked piece of correspondence from a traveling school teacher mentions how she used the frost on her breath to entertain her students, blowing onto glass to make patterns before lessons. They learned letters in the fog, she wrote, and for a moment the cold became a friend. Education and warmth intertwined in the simplest of gestures. Now imagine stepping outside before dawn. Your breath plumes upward and vanishes into the starlight. The air smells clean, almost metallic. The silence is so deep you can hear the faint crackle of frost forming on your coat. You realize that to breathe here is to participate in the same ritual as those before you. Every breath is borrowed heat, every exhale a quiet surrender to the cold. The pioneers did not have words for oxygen levels or humidity balance, but they understood equilibrium in practice. Their survival depended on it. Breath too heavy, and you suffocate. Breath too light, and the fire dies. Life existed in that narrow space between. You settle into that thought, imagining the condensation collecting on beams above you, glittering faintly in the candlelight. The air inside the cabin moves just enough to stay alive. In that gentle movement, you feel the hidden wisdom of people who learn to live by listening not to machines or numbers, but to the sound of their own breathing. Morning comes quietly, the kind of gray light that barely touches the snow. You can smell damp earth beneath the floorboards and hear a faint dripping somewhere outside. In the world of the pioneers, cold did not only freeze, it preserved. Long before the hum of refrigerators, people learned that winter itself was the best guardian of food. They built small empires out of ice and patience. One detailed entry from an 1850 farmer's ledger tells of cool houses dug into the ground, lined with stone and packed with straw. These root cellars kept vegetables edible for months. The earth held a steady temperature, cool enough to prevent spoilage, but warm enough to keep potatoes from turning to stone. Inside those low, damp chambers, the scent of soil and onions mingled with the faint sweetness of stored apples. The air was heavy, but it smelled like survival. Settlers also became masters of timing. They knew that cutting ice from ponds in the heart of winter was not a luxury, it was a future. Whole communities would gather for the ice harvest. Men soared blocks from frozen lakes, while horses dragged them to shore. Women packed the pieces into ice sawdust-lined pits or ice houses built beside barns. That stored ice could last through summer if handled correctly. One remarkable note from a Boston merchant's correspondence describes how such ice was shipped as far as the Caribbean and India. Wrapped in sawdust, it traveled in the hold of ships, shrinking but not vanishing. The 19th century had its own version of global refrigeration, powered entirely by winter's generosity. The irony was perfect. Tropical elites cooled their drinks with northern frost. A lesser-known frontier custom involved using snow itself as storage. Families buried meat or butter in packed drifts, marking the spot with sticks. They trusted the cold to guard it from decay and predators alike. Some even used snow to store milk overnight, creating an early version of cold pasteurization. The taste was earthy and faintly metallic, but it was safe. Modern historians still discuss whether these practices were born of science or pure intuition. The evidence suggests both. The pioneers learned through repetition, memorizing how fast food spoiled in different weather, how tightly to pack straw around barrels, how to layer moss for insulation. Trial and error became tradition. There is something comforting in picturing it. Imagine stepping into a root cellar lit by a single candle. The walls sweat with cold and your breath curls upward into the stillness. Rows of jars gleam in the dim light, their contents suspended in liquid amber. You could almost taste the salted beans and smoked meats waiting for spring. The silence there is absolute, the air faintly sweet with fermentation and frost. One curious account from Norway settlers mentions an ice room, a pit lined with moss and peat where milk was set to thicken overnight. In the morning, they found it creamy and cold, the chill lending it a flavor impossible to recreate today. They called it sleeping milk, a phrase that sounds like poetry but came from observation. Cold made things rest instead of rot. The cold also shaped their trade networks. A farmer who mastered ice storage could barter with neighbors during summer. Butter, meat, and berries became currency. One farm's pond might feed an entire town's supply of cool air months later. It turned winter labor into summer wealth. There was a danger to this knowledge, too. Improperly stored food carried disease. Some letters warn of tainted milk from cellars that grew mold, or meat that turned black at the edges. Those experiences became hard lessons carved into memory.
It was not enough to keep food cold. It had to breathe. Even underground, the pioneers learned to leave small vents, letting air exchange slowly between earth and sky. An overlooked innovation from the 1822 was the use of clay jars buried in snowbanks for butter storage. The method created natural refrigeration that kept fat solid without freezing. In spring, the jars were dug up, often still cool inside. Archaeologists have found remnants of those makeshift fridges, their layers of straw still faintly intact. Modern people rely on the click of a thermostat or the quiet hum of a freezer. The pioneers relied on instinct and patience. They trusted the way cold slowed time, how it suspended decay like a long breath held between seasons. There was reverence in that trust. They understood that nature could be an ally when respected. As you imagine standing in that cellar, the candle flickers. You hear water dripping slowly from the ceiling. The cold seeps into your boots, but it feels like a living thing, not a threat. Everything around you is suspended in waiting. Apples sleep in wooden crates. Potatoes breathe through straw. Jars murmur softly as gases escape their lids. This stillness is both science and faith. When you climb back into the open air, the cold rushes against your face like a greeting. Above you, smoke curls from chimneys, and the scent of preserved meat drifts faintly through the wind. The pioneers did not fight the cold. They made peace with it. They learned to let it do their work while they rested. You stand there for a moment, letting the air bite at your cheeks, and realize the beauty of that forgotten wisdom. Cold is not the enemy of life. It is its guardian, holding time still until we are ready again to begin. The day brightens, and the sunlight pouring through the frost-covered window smells of pine and smoke. You notice something unusual for such a harsh environment. The crisp air feels cleaner than you expect. The pioneers believed winter was not just a time to endure, but a time to purify. When the world froze, they saw a chance to reset everything from their homes to their own bodies. Letters from early settlers mention how winter was often called the cleansing season. The cold halted decay, slowed disease, and made the air taste new. People waited for frost before fumigating homes, washing clothes, and airing out bedding. They would open windows wide, letting frigid wind sweep through rooms, trusting the cold to chase away sickness. It was an act of faith as much as hygiene. One domestic guide from 1842 recommends placing quilts and wool garments outside on the snow for an hour at midday. The cold, the author wrote, kills the unseen creatures that feast upon cloth. Today, we know she meant lice and mites, but to her, frost was a kind of invisible soap. The same method was used for books, letters, and even musical instruments. A few minutes in the open air made them smell clean of the year. A curious detail found in a New Hampshire's widow's journal tells of scrubbing the floors with snow packed into cloth. The melting ice lifted dirt as it vanished, leaving wood pale and dry. She called it washing with silence. It was both work and meditation, a slow ritual of cleansing that left behind not perfume, but peace. Medical records from frontier towns showed that people noticed a pattern: fewer illnesses in winter. They did not understand bacteria, but they noticed that frost brought health. Cold baths, snow rubs, and icy walks became forms of rustic therapy. One traveler wrote that dipping his face into snow tightened the spirit. Others swore by drinking melted icicles as a cure for sore throats. Modern science might roll its eyes, yet cryotherapy and cold plunges echo that same intuition. The cold even cleaned the air itself. Without modern pollution, smoke from chimneys hung briefly before the frost captured it, pressing it down. The sky seemed sharper, the stars closer. Settlers often wrote about winter light as if it had healing powers. It bleached sickness from the world, at least in their minds. There were strange customs too. Some families left their mattresses outside overnight once a month in the dead of winter. They believed moonlight and frost together could renew the fiber.
Others placed spoons or scissors on windowsills to let the metal rest. These gestures seem quaint now, but they reveal something profound. The pioneers trusted nature to do what medicine and machines could not. Researchers studying domestic traditions have found that the act of cleaning in winter was not just practical, but psychological. It was a moment to reclaim control in a season that took control of everything else. When you scrubbed the walls or shook out quilts into the snow, you weren't just removing dust, you were pushing back against the vastness of the cold. You were saying quietly that life still belonged here. Imagine the sight of clotheslines strung between frozen trees, linens snapping like sails in the wind, their surfaces stiff with frost before softening again. The sound was delicate, almost musical, fabric striking ice with each gust. Inside, the scent of thawed cloth filled the room, a smell clean enough to taste. A lesser-known account from Russia's Siberian settlers tells of using snow as soap. They rubbed it through hair, on faces, on hands hardened by labor. The skin turned pink, almost painful, but afterward felt new. They claimed it woke the blood. You can imagine the sting, the shock, and then the calm that followed. Modern observers might laugh at the idea of washing with snow, yet the pioneers lived in harmony with cycles we barely notice. They did not wait for spring to feel renewal. Winter itself offered that transformation. It stripped the world to its essentials, left everything bare, and in that bareness was clarity. Inside those tiny cabins, after days of cleaning, there must have been a peculiar satisfaction. The air would feel sharp. The floorboards gleam faintly with frost water. The blankets smelled faintly of pine and cold. People sat by their stoves and breathed deeply, not just from warmth, but from accomplishment. Their homes were smaller than ours, but their sense of space was larger, because they lived in rhythm with the season.
Some anthropologists believe that this connection to seasonal cleansing shaped early frontier spirituality. The idea that winter could purify both body and soul made hardship meaningful. Cold was not punishment, it was renewal disguised as difficulty. As you imagine that, the scent of clean frost and smoke fills your lungs. You can almost feel the chill on your face, the faint sting that wakes you from the inside out. The pioneers may not have had antiseptics or air filters, but they understood something elemental. When the world froze, it did not die. It rested, reset, and prepared to begin again. You sit quietly in that understanding, feeling the stillness settle around you. The air in your mind clears, the noise falls away, and even now you can sense the peace those people felt after a long day of washing, shaking, and breathing in the clean silence of the frozen world. The scent reaches you before the warmth does. It is smoke, rich and layered, filled with pine resin, oak sap, and the faint sweetness of burning bark. To a pioneer, that smell meant safety. A home without smoke was a home in danger. You could almost hear the sigh of relief when the chimney caught and the first curl of gray lifted into the sky. Letters from the 1800s often begin with a line about the fire. The smoke draws well today. That was more than small talk. It was a sign that life continued smoothly. A good fire meant a good roof, dry wood, and lungs that could breathe without choking.
Smoke carried meaning in every wisp. A particularly vivid description in a prairie journal explains that each type of wood told its own story in scent and color. Hickory burned bright and steady. Oak gave slow, deep heat, and birch snapped like tiny fireworks. Pine smoked thick and aromatic, filling every seam in the cabin with perfume. The smell clung to clothes and hair, following people wherever they went. Even years later, returning travelers could identify home by the faint ghost of that same scent on their belongings. One interesting domestic observation from a settler's wife describes how they judged the weather by the way smoke behaved. If it drifted downward, snow or rain was on the way. If it rose straight and clear, the air would stay dry and cold. Before thermometers or barometers, they read the sky through their chimneys. A curious trick found in a New England notebook tells of mixing dried herbs with wood chips to scent the room. Sage, thyme, or even apple peel added to the fire made the cabin smell both cleaner and safer. Some believed certain herbs could keep away illness. Others simply liked the feeling of summer hidden in the embers. But smoke had its dangers too. In poorly ventilated huts, the air thickened until eyes burned and throats scraped raw. Many early families suffered from what they called the black cough, caused by constant exposure. Modern researchers identify it as early lung disease. Yet to the pioneers, it was just the price of survival. Despite that, no one truly hated smoke. It was too essential. The smell meant warmth, cooking, company. Children fell asleep to it. Travelers could find their way home by it. Some families even claimed each household had its own smoke signature, a distinct blend of wood, air, and resin. You could tell who was burning what from a mile away. An overlooked account from an 1872 fire warden mentions how smoke also served as protection. In forested regions, settlers deliberately filled the air with controlled fires to keep predators at bay. Wolves and bears avoided the scent of burning wood, and even mosquitoes vanished when the smoke thickened. The column of haze above a homestead was not a blemish on the landscape, it was a flag of endurance. Historians have noted that pioneers treated their chimneys almost like sacred spaces. A blocked flue was a crisis. Cleaning it was a ritual. Some used bundles of thorny brush, others lowered chains through to knock away soot. Children were told never to whistle near the chimney for fear of calling the wind. Whether that was superstition or simply habit, it gave the fireplace a personality, something between a guardian and a temperamental friend.
There was poetry in the way they spoke about it. One old miner in the Yukon wrote that his chimney breathed like an old man's chest. You can picture him there, sitting near the hearth, listening to that breathing, half comforted, half haunted by its rhythm. The sound of crackling logs and the low sigh of escaping smoke made the nights feel alive. Modern life has reduced fire to a convenience, sealed behind glass and ignited by switches. The pioneers knew fire as intimacy. It required feeding, watching, and listening. The smell of smoke was their reminder that something powerful and unpredictable shared their home. In the deepest winters, when the wind screamed outside and frost crawled down the windows, smoke became the only movement that connected indoors and out. It rose through the roof, carrying whispers of human life into the cold heavens. If you stood outside at dusk and saw a column of smoke drifting from another cabin, it felt like companionship, even across miles of frozen wilderness. There were stories, too, about what happened when the smoke stopped. A silent chimney was a terrible sign. Neighbors would walk through drifts to check, knowing what they might find. The absence of smoke was as meaningful as its presence. Life and death both smelled of wood and ash. Now you imagine sitting by that fire, eyes half closed, watching the smoke curl upward in ribbons of gray and gold. The logs hiss softly, releasing trapped sap like tiny sighs. Your clothes absorb the scent, and you know it will cling to you for days, maybe weeks. It feels grounding, ancient, honest. The pioneers understood what that smell meant. It was memory in motion, the soul of their homes made visible. The smoke that escaped their roofs told the world they were still there, holding the line between survival and surrender. And even as it stung their eyes and blackened their ceilings, it also whispered something eternal. You are alive, and the fire still answers you. Night stretches long across the frontier, and the stars shine with a kind of hard, patient light. You sit beside the quiet fire, feeling the room pulse with its steady warmth, and begin to understand that cold was not only a force of nature to the pioneers, it was a moral teacher. The chill of winter tested not just the body, but the heart, shaping values in ways that temperate comfort never could. An entry in a farmer's diary from 1863 reflects that sentiment perfectly. The cold makes honest men. It will not let you lie about your strength. Those words ring with pride, but they also carry humility. Every breath of winter reminded people of their place in the world. They could not bluff against a blizzard or charm the frost from their fingers. Nature set the rules, and survival depended on listening. Religious communities in frontier settlements often preached that winter was divine correction. Ministers compared snow to purity, frost to divine discipline. Congregations gathered in unheated chapels, wrapped in blankets, breath rising like incense in the air. Faith was a bodily experience, and endurance became proof of devotion. One sermon written in Pennsylvania described the cold as God's pause, when the world must bow and be still. Not everyone agreed, of course. Letters from skeptical homesteaders show a more pragmatic view. They treated the cold as a teacher, yes, but one whose lessons came through hardship rather than grace. The frost reminds me that I am small, but also that I am clever, one woman wrote. She learned to take pride in adaptation, not submission. There was a shared belief that the cold revealed character. A person who helped neighbors chop wood or shared coals for a dying hearth earned deep respect. Someone who hoarded warmth or complained too loudly lost it. The season turned morality into survival strategy. Compassion was not sentiment, it was insulation. A curious bit of folklore from Scandinavian settlers tells of winter honesty. It was said that you could tell a person's true nature by how they behaved in a storm. The helpful stayed kind. The selfish hid behind doors. This belief shaped community trust in ways that laws never could. Modern historians suggest that this moral view of weather grew from necessity. In an environment where one mistake could kill, virtues like humility and cooperation were practical tools. Yet over time, these habits became part of the cultural fabric. People started to describe good neighbors as steady as frost, meaning dependable, uncomplaining, and quietly strong. There were also spiritual disciplines connected to cold. Some families practiced what they called the fast of frost, deliberately going without extra firewood for a night as an act of gratitude for what they had. They claimed it sharpened the senses and softened the ego. You can almost imagine them huddled together, whispering prayers between chattering teeth, laughing through the discomfort. One lesser-known account from a missionary journal tells of settlers who found peace in the rhythmic sound of snow falling on roofs. They said it reminded them to stay still, to breathe slowly, to wait. Patience was the only prayer winter ever demanded. The cold also humbled the proud.
Wealth offered little protection once the wind began to howl. A fine coat might delay frostbite, but not prevent it. Those who had once measured success by land or coin found themselves equalized by temperature. In that way, the cold leveled society more effectively than law or politics. There was a quiet dignity in their endurance. Surviving a harsh winter became a form of testimony. People did not boast about riches, they boasted about winters endured. Children heard bedtime tales not of heroes slaying monsters, but of grandparents who survived the great freeze of such and such year. It gave their lineage weight, like family myth forged in ice. An intriguing psychological note from modern researchers suggests that long exposure to cold can alter mood and perception. The brain slows, conserving energy. Thoughts become deliberate, words sparse. The pioneers called it winter mind. They valued it. In that calm, they found focus and introspection. Some even wrote that clarity came only when the world froze quiet. Imagine sitting there, wrapped in wool, the sound of the wind rattling through cracks in the wall, knowing that you were alive because you listened, prepared, and endured. The lesson of cold is patience, and the pioneers learned it deeply. They found morality not in grand declarations, but in small, repeated acts of endurance. Chopping, mending, sharing, surviving.
You can feel it even now if you close your eyes. The quiet pride that comes from holding still in a harsh world. The pioneers would have recognized that feeling instantly. To them, warmth was not simply comfort, it was virtue made visible. They did not ask for ease, they asked for strength enough to keep the fire alive until spring. And when spring finally came, they did not forget who they had been in the cold. The frost left the fields, but it stayed inside their hearts as discipline, a reminder that struggle could be sacred if faced with courage and care. The air feels sharper today, the kind that pinches your skin before your mind fully wakes. You step outside and see the world glazed in white, sparkling with the sort of quiet only deep cold can bring. The pioneers knew that winter was not merely an obstacle, it was a medicine chest. They found healing in the ice, remedies in the snow, and renewal in the very element that threatened to destroy them. A record from an 1837 Frontier Medical Manual describes the snow cure, a treatment that involved rubbing frost across swollen joints or aching limbs. The text explained in plain script that cold tightens the flesh and drives out the pain. The logic was crude, but in its simplicity there was truth. Modern cryotherapy echoes the same idea, though wrapped in Kroman science. The pioneers already understood what doctors later named circulation therapy. One curious recollection from a mountain trapper's diary mentions packing snow around his twisted ankle and sleeping with it all night. He wrote that the swelling shrank by morning and the pain had gone silent. He also noted that he dreamed vividly, as if the body and mind cooled together.
The idea that cold affected not just muscles, but dreams fascinated many. Some claimed that sleeping in frigid rooms made their thoughts clearer, their tempers calmer. Women on the frontier also found ways to use ice medically. Letters from Minnesota settlers described collecting snow water to wash the face and eyes. They believed it kept the skin young and reduced headaches. Mothers pressed cold cloths soaked in melted frost to children's foreheads during fevers. Even without understanding inflammation, they knew that cold slowed the fire within. Travelers carried little pouches of ice wrapped in cloth to soothe bruises or burns. When no ice was available, they used river stones cooled in snow. Each method came from observation, not instruction. People learned from nature's rhythm, paying attention to how quickly pain faded when the body met cold air. A rare account from a frontier doctor reveals another strange practice. Patients were sometimes made to breathe cold air deeply before sunrise, believed to shock the lungs awake. He insisted it strengthened the chest. Modern pulmonologists might smile at the superstition. Yet, fresh air therapy became a cornerstone of later sanatoriums. The pioneers did not separate medicine from daily life. Cold was woven into every routine.
They drank snow melt flavored with pine needles to ease sore throats. They bathed feet in icy water to prevent infection after long treks. Some even believed that eating a handful of clean snow could steady the heart. Whether placebo or truth, the ritual offered comfort. Researchers exploring historical health customs point out that early settlers practiced temperature therapy instinctively. When illness came, they alternated between fire and frost. Fevers were treated by rubbing snow on wrists and ankles, then wrapping the patient in warm blankets. The cycle continued until the body found balance. They called it chasing the heat. There was symbolism in it too. Cold represented renewal. When crops failed or animals died, people spoke of letting the frost take the sorrow. They believed that grief, like sickness, could freeze and shatter under enough winter air. In communities where life and death sat side by side, that belief mattered. One peculiar note from an herbalist's notebook mentions keeping vials of melted snow labeled by date. She claimed that each snowfall had a different quality, depending on the moon. Some melted fast, some slow. She prescribed the slower melting ones for fatigue, the quick ones for anxiety. To modernize, it reads like magic, yet her patients swore by it. Modern scientists still debate how much of this frontier medicine worked in measurable ways. The line between superstition and intuition was thin. What cannot be denied is that the cold forced observation. When you live with nature as closely as they did, every flake and breeze becomes a teacher. You can imagine sitting in that small cabin, a child coughing in the corner, the mother lifting a bowl of fresh snow and waiting for it to melt into clear water. The father tends the fire. The air crackles with both smoke and prayer. When the snow finally softens into liquid, she dips a cloth, lays it on the child's brow, and hums quietly. Outside, the storm rages. Inside, healing feels close enough to touch. It is strange, isn't it, how we forget the simplicity of such acts.
Today, we buy bottles labeled cold therapy gel, sterile, and perfect. The pioneers trusted the world itself to provide the same medicine for free. They respected pain as part of the cure, not something to erase. When morning comes, the frost on the window glows with soft light. The air feels new again. Somewhere in that imagined silence, you sense gratitude. A family alive, a child resting easier, a home that still holds warmth. The pioneers did not invent healing. They remembered it in every flake of snow that fell upon their roofs. The first sound that greets you this morning is not the wind or the creak of timber, but a soft, rhythmic murmur coming from the barn. You step outside, and the air smells faintly of hay and frost.
The animals are awake before you are, moving slowly through clouds of their own breath. For the pioneers, these creatures were more than companions. They were living weather stations, teachers, and sometimes prophets of the cold. A note in a farmer's log from 1854 mentions that when cattle grew restless at dusk, pouring at the ground or facing a single direction, frost was near. Horses that refused water meant ice was coming overnight. Geese lifting into sudden flight predicted snow. Every creature carried a message, and the pioneers learned to read them all. One particularly detailed entry from a trapper's notebook describes foxes digging deeper dens before a temperature drop. He took that as his cue to seal the cabin's cracks with moss. He wrote, "The foxes know what the clouds will not tell." That sentence alone captures how intimately people listen to the natural world. Researchers examining early farm diaries have found that livestock behavior formed a kind of organic forecasting system. Chickens clustered under low beams before storms. Pigs grunted louder and ate faster. Dogs turned in tighter circles on cold nights, creating deeper nests in straw.
Without thermometers, these signs guided every plan for firewood travel and even childbirth. One curious detail from an English settler's account explains that cats were treated as both companions and omens. A cat grooming its fur facing the window meant mild weather ahead. A cat hiding its nose in its tail predicted bitter frost. Whether anyone truly believed it or not, the ritual of noticing brought calm to long winters. Watching an animal closely was a way of watching the world. A little-known observation from Arctic traders tells of using reindeer breath as a guide for travel. When the vapor from their nostrils fell quickly, it meant air pressure was dropping. That was the signal to turn back before a whiteout. The pioneers had no barometers, yet they carried living ones at their side. Even farm dogs played their part. When a dog's fur stood out stiff from its body, farmers said the frost had teeth. One mother in Vermont wrote that she always sent her son to bed early when their hound began to curl up by the hearth instead of the doorway. "The dog knows the night," she wrote simply. Modern scholars studying animal science have confirmed that many of these observations held truth. Changes in barometric pressure, humidity, and static electricity influence animal behavior long before humans can sense a shift. The pioneers might not have known the terms, but their trust in instinct was accurate. Beyond prediction, animals gave warmth in a more literal sense. Cowshed walls radiated heat. Chickens clustered like living blankets, raising barn temperatures by several degrees. Some settlers built sleeping lofts directly above stalls, so body heat from livestock would rise through the floorboards. It was practical and strangely comforting. An overlooked letter from an Irish immigrant woman recalls nights when the family gathered in the stable during storms. She wrote that the rhythmic sound of cows chewing hay was the kindest sound in the world. It lulled children to sleep when the wind outside howled like a living thing. The pioneers believed animals possessed a wisdom that humans had lost. One preacher even delivered a sermon titled Lessons from the Ox, comparing patience in hardship to the steady, uncomplaining gaze of working beasts. To him, survival was not about domination, but imitation. Watch the animals, he said, and you will learn how to endure. There were also legends. Some told of birds vanishing before deep freezes, taking warmth with them. Others said owls carried messages from the coming frost. Children grew up half fearing, half admiring these signs. Every sound outside after dark felt like a whisper of what tomorrow might bring. Modern biologists might call this an early form of ethology, but for the pioneers, it was simply common sense. They could not afford to ignore what the animals said. Every misplaced hoofprint or restless night in the barn was data. Each cry in the wind, each paw on the snow, was a piece of the grand conversation between life and weather. Imagine standing there now, lantern in hand, listening to the quiet chorus of breathing in the barn. The warm musk of straw fills your nose, and the cold presses against your back. You can feel the peace in it, the understanding that these creatures are part of your own survival. Their steadiness is your reassurance. When dawn spreads, the animals move in slow, deliberate rhythm. Steam rises from their backs, mingling with the pale sunlight. You watch them and realize how much of life the pioneers learned not from books or sermons, but from hooves, feathers, and breath. The animals taught them the language of weather, and they listened as if their lives depended on it, because they did. The cold has settled deep now, the kind that makes the wood of the cabin crack like gunfire in the night. You run your hand along the wall and feel the rough grain of logs, each one fitted with a craftsman's patience. The pioneers built homes that didn't fight the cold directly, but bent around it, trapping heat like secret treasure. Their architecture was a conversation between endurance and imagination. Old surveyor maps from the 1800s show how settlements in harsh climates favored the smallest possible footprint. Low ceilings, narrow rooms, and thick walls helped preserve warmth. Builders knew that air, not fire, was the real insulator. The less space to heat, the longer the fire lasted.
Each corner of a cabin had purpose. Kitchens shared walls with sleeping areas so that cooking heat doubled as nighttime warmth. One letter from a Norwegian settler describes her husband's miracle chimney. He designed it to pull air in from a trench beneath the house, warming it before it reached the hearth. It was primitive engineering, yet remarkably effective. He called it the Earth's breath. The structure funneled cold air through soil where it softened before touching flame. In that simple invention lies the ancestor of modern heat exchangers. A particularly inventive frontier family used sawed bricks to build their home. Each layer of earth, grass, and root held moisture that froze solid, creating walls as dense as stone. In spring, they softened again, breathing like living skin. Visitors mocked them for living inside, a garden turned inside out. But those houses stood longer than the lumber cabins nearby. Archaeologists who study pioneer dwellings note that their design revealed priorities: conservation over comfort, function over display. Every inch of space worked. Storage nooks were cut into wall gaps. Doors were draped with quilts instead of wood, and chimneys were often placed in the center rather than at the edge. The goal was to make every spark of heat travel the farthest possible distance. A curious domestic solution recorded in a Kansas homestead journal describes how settlers made heat traps by hanging thick curtains across doorways. The fabric divided rooms into layers of warmth. The front room might hover just above freezing, but behind the curtain by the fire, the air turned soft and almost cozy. Children slept closest to the hearth, their dreams painted orange by the flickering light. Some families even built false ceilings, canvas sheets strung low across rafters to trap warmth from escaping upward. In the mornings, frost sometimes gathered on those makeshift ceilings like stars, melting at sunrise and dripping rhythmically into basins placed below. It was as if the house itself exhaled the night.
Modern architectural historians often debate how much of this design came from European influence and how much from experimentation in the New World. The conclusion is always the same. Adaptation was everything. The pioneers didn't just transplant their traditions, they reshaped them to fit new temperatures, new materials, new threats. One lesser-known story from the Great Plains tells of a widowed woman who built her entire cabin facing slightly northeast rather than south. Neighbors thought her odd until they noticed her roof collected less snow and her windows frosted more slowly. She had learned from the slope of hills and the angle of sunrise. Her home was attuned to the land itself. You can picture one of these homes at dusk, walls glistening faintly with resin, smoke rising in a thin line through the roof, the inside glowing dim gold. The air hums with a steady heat that feels almost sacred. The fire whispers low and the walls hold its memory. The scent of baked bread mixes with smoke and damp pine. Everything seems still yet alive. A rarely discussed detail in carpentry notes shows that some pioneers embedded stones around fireplaces, not only for stability, but to hold and release heat slowly overnight. Those stones became silent companions, still warm by morning. A child might press a hand to one and feel comfort even before the day began. As you imagine the quiet of that house, you realize how much intelligence went into every nail, every board, every choice of direction. Nothing was built for vanity. Even beauty was born from necessity. The lines of the roof followed the wind's logic. The placement of a window depended on how the light hit frost at noon. The result was architecture that breathed, listened, and adapted. You sit there in thought, tracing your fingers along the idea of warmth captured by design.
The pioneers could not afford waste, and yet, through that restraint, they created elegance. The cabins were small, but the lessons they contained were vast. To survive the cold, they had to think like it, move with it, and build homes that understood what their builders could only sense. The sound of the wind outside returns, brushing against the walls, testing for weakness. But inside, everything holds. The warmth stays. The structure hums with quiet defiance. Proof that human will, when joined with patience, can shape even the harshest season into something close to comfort. The night deepens, and the fire crackles softly, a rhythm that feels older than speech. You sit close enough to feel the heat kiss your face, but not so close that the sparks sting. Outside, snow whispers against the door, and inside, a circle of light holds the darkness at bay. In that small world, warmth was not just a private comfort, it was a social event.
The pioneers knew that sharing heat meant sharing life itself. Old community records from frontier towns reveal that wood was more than fuel. It was currency, gossip, and goodwill wrapped into one. Neighbors compared their stacks the way people now compare cars or homes. A tall, neat pile of split logs meant respectability. A sloppy heap meant laziness or poor planning. During hard winters, trading wood was as common as trading flour. To borrow a log was a phrase that carried the weight of trust. One recollection from an Illinois farmer's daughter tells of winter evenings when families gathered in one another's cabins, bringing small bundles of firewood as a gesture of thanks. The host's fire burned brighter for a night, and in return, everyone shared stories. The air smelled of sap and smoke, but beneath it ran another fragrance, the warmth of company. A curious domestic habit from diaries of the time was called fire gossip. People would sit near the hearth and talk only while watching the flames. It was said that whatever was spoken in that glow stayed there. The fire heard confessions, jokes, and plans. No one interrupted another while the logs burned down. When the last ember dimmed, the conversation ended too. It was an unspoken ritual, half spiritual, half practical. Researchers studying social history have pointed out that such gatherings shaped entire frontier communities. The fire circle was a parliament, a classroom, and a therapist's chair all at once. Politics, births, marriages, and losses were all discussed in that dim, fragrant light. The cold outside made people honest. Words came slower, softer, and truer when every syllable had to pass through clouds of breath. One remarkable letter from a blacksmith in Maine describes how he and his neighbors competed to keep fires burning the most efficiently. They swapped tricks for how to cut wood with less waste, how to stack logs for best airflow, how to bank coals overnight. He wrote proudly, "We make our flames stretch farther than our coin." Efficiency was its own kind of artistry. A lesser-known bit of frontier etiquette warned against letting your fire go out completely. Visitors would see a cold hearth as a bad omen, a sign of neglect or despair. Even if only a few coals glowed,
They represented hope. The same principle applied to community bonds. Warmth must be maintained even in scarcity. You can picture it easily now. A family sits together under the low ceiling, their faces lit from below by the orange dance of flame. The father sharpens a blade. The mother sews. A child pokes a stick into the coals just to watch the sparks leap. Someone hums, someone laughs. Every creak of the logs and sigh of the fire feels like a heartbeat. An overlooked detail from an 1872 regional journal mentions that people often measured time by the burning of wood. 3 logs worth could mean an evening of talk or the distance between towns when traveling with portable embers. Fire was both clock and compass. In moments of solitude, the fire also offered company. Many diaries describe settlers speaking to the flames during long nights. It was not madness, but a comfort. "The fire listens," one man wrote during a blizzard that trapped him for 6 days. "It does not argue, it only answers in light." Modern psychologists might call this a form of mindfulness, the way the steady sound of crackling soothed anxiety and kept loneliness at bay. To the pioneers, it was simply living in rhythm with something alive. The fire consumed what they gathered, and in return, it gave light enough to make the darkness bearable. The smell of wood smoke marked everything they owned. Coats, blankets, and hair carried it through the seasons. When spring finally came, the fading of that scent felt strange, almost sad. It meant the nights were warming, but also that something faithful had ended. Imagine stepping out of the cabin late at night, watching the plume of smoke rise into the stars. The snow glows faintly with reflected firelight. You feel how small your warmth is in all that space, yet how miraculous it seems that such a small circle of heat can hold back an entire winter. That was the quiet genius of the pioneers. They made their lives one fire at a time, shared it, tended it, and passed it on. Each spark was both survival and story, flickering in the same rhythm as their hearts. Even now, if you close your eyes, you can still hear the wood sighing as it burns, and feel the invisible thread of fellowship that once held a frozen world together. The cold carries a different mood now.
It is no longer a threat, but a guide, shaping movement and timing. You stand at the edge of a frozen field and look across miles of quiet earth. The horizon shimmers like glass, the air so still it feels fragile. The pioneers trusted that stillness more than any calendar. Their journeys, their planting, their very lives followed the language of temperature, not dates. One entry in a settler's weather journal from 1849 notes that the river speaks before the leaves do. He meant that when the ice began to thin and shift, you could hear spring approaching days before it was visible. The groaning of ice became an early warning. That sound told farmers when to start preparing seed, when to mend plows, when to begin again. The sun did not decide the seasons, the cold did. A curious practice recorded among wagon train travelers involved testing the earth by breath. Men would crouch low and blow on the soil. If the vapor lingered white, the ground still held frost. If it vanished, the thaw had begun. It was a moment of quiet connection, a small gesture of respect to the land before demanding anything from it. Researchers who study frontier agriculture have confirmed that pioneers developed intricate temperature calendars. They counted days of frost, not weeks of months. The third hard freeze meant it was time to slaughter livestock for storage. The first soft morning meant to repair fences. Time was not measured in numbers, but sensations. The bite of air on the cheek, the sound of water dripping from eaves, the weight of snow underfoot. One remarkable diary from a homesteader in Nebraska describes how his family's migration west was determined entirely by frost cycles. He wrote, "When the nights lose their shine, we go." He meant that once frost stopped sparkling under the moon, the balance had shifted. It was safe to move. Such poetic accuracy guided thousands of miles of human movement long before maps could. A less-known observation from European settlers in Canada explains that they used the color of animal fur as a seasonal signal. When hares and foxes began turning white early, they prepared for a long winter. If the change came late, travel season extended. It was part science, part intuition, but always survival. Cold dictated trade as well. Frozen rivers turned into highways for sleds and wagons. In winter, routes that were impossible mud in summer became solid, gleaming corridors. Merchants planned journeys around freezing points, timing departures to match the land's transformation. In spring, those same routes vanished back into water. People said the land lent itself to them for a season and then took it back. One overlooked letter from a fur trader in 1831 tells how he measured distance not in miles, but in degrees of chill. "When my breath freezes before it leaves my beard, I am halfway to Fort York," he wrote. It sounds poetic, but it was literal navigation. Each territory had its own kind of cold, a specific taste and sound. To the experienced, air temperature was as distinct as a scent. The cold even influenced language. Old-timers talked about good frost and bad frost, talking cold that warned of snow and quiet cold that meant safety. They described how snow squeaked at 20 degrees and whispered at 0. Their vocabulary was precise, their awareness profound. Every step outside was an act of listening. Modern historians still debate whether such sensitivity to weather was instinctive or trained through hardship. Most agree it was both. Children grew up learning to judge frost by how it formed on fences or how quickly their breath drifted upward. By adulthood, They could read the world as clearly as we read screens. Imagine watching the sky as they did. You see clouds forming low and heavy, the kind that swallow sound. You feel a drop in air pressure as a faint ache in your bones. The smell changes too, sharper, almost metallic. You know snow is coming long before the first flake appears. That intimacy with the environment created confidence, not fear. One quaint ritual described in Scandinavian immigrant letters involved giving thanks to the first thaw.
Families would stand outside in silence as the first drip from the roof broke the winter stillness. They treated it as a moment of sacred renewal. Children laughed, dogs barked, and grown men sometimes cried. After months of stillness, motion returned to the world, and with it, hope. The pioneers did not own clocks that mattered. They did not need them. Frost, wind, sunlight, and soil told them all they needed to know. When you live that close to nature, your pulse becomes part of its rhythm. The seasons do not pass, they breathe. You look out over the imagined field again. The ice is melting now, thin sheets breaking with tiny cracks that echo like bells. In that fragile music, you feel the ancient precision of those who learned to travel, plant, and live by listening to the cold. Their calendars were written not on paper, but in the frozen breath of the earth itself. The morning air is so cold that sound itself seems to slow. When you step outside, the crunch of snow under your boots feels louder than your thoughts. Yet, in the silence that follows, there is music. The pioneers understood this strange symphony of winter. They listened to the frozen world and found rhythm in stillness, melody in the crackle of ice, and harmony in the quiet between gusts of wind. A journal from a frontier fiddler tells of nights when strings would tighten until they almost snapped. He wrote that he could hear the frost tuning before he even touched the bow. On such nights, the air made every note sharper, brighter, almost fragile. The music carried far, echoing across frozen valleys, each tone cutting through the night like light through glass. Historians who study folk traditions note that cold weather shaped not only the music, but also the instruments themselves. Violins, flutes, and even drums sounded different when the temperature dropped. Musicians learned to warm their hands over coals, to play slower so their fingers wouldn't stiffen. Some wrapped thin cloth around their instruments to protect the wood from cracking. The pioneers didn't have concert halls. They had barns and frozen porches. Their songs belonged to the air. One curious account from a diary kept by a traveling preacher mentions how his congregation sang softer in winter because the echo lasted longer. "The walls hum after we stop," he wrote. "It is as if the cold keeps the song." Anyone who has walked in snow at night knows that feeling. Sound lingers differently, suspended, pure. Modern scientists call this acoustic phenomenon thermic stress, but to the pioneers, it was something sacred. They spoke of the ice breathing, of the earth itself making music in its sleep. When nights grew too long or loneliness too heavy,
Families would step outside together, hold hands, and listen. No one talked. They didn't need to. Inside their cabins, sound had its own life. Fires popped softly, wood shifted, kettles hissed, and people spoke in voices that barely rose above whispers. In that confined space, silence was valuable. You didn't waste words, you felt them. One settler wrote, "In winter, you speak only when the air deserves to carry it." Children found joy in the smallest sounds, the scrape of skates on frozen ponds, the rattle of sleigh bells, the rhythmic crunch of sled runners. That music of motion became part of memory, binding generations to the same simple pleasures. The pioneers may not have had pianos or orchestras, but they had snow that sang and ice that answered. A curious observation from a Maine homesteader describes how he tuned his fiddle to the temperature. At 30 degrees, he loosened the strings 2 turns. At 10 degrees, 3 turns. "Play too tight," he warned, "and the night will break your tune." He claimed that the sound of a well-tuned fiddle could travel 2 miles in clear, cold air. Perhaps that's true. The cold carries sound in ways warmth never could. Researchers of early American folk music suggest that winter gatherings by firelight were where many enduring melodies were born. The limitations of the season breeded creativity. Slow tempos, soft chords, and repetition matched the rhythm of breathing in the cold. Songs like lullabies for survival. Imagine one of those nights now, a circle of faces half lit by flame. Someone hums while another taps gently on the side of a pot. Outside, snow muffles everything. Inside, each sound feels alive. The fiddle begins, the voice follows, and the room fills with something warmer than the fire itself. The melody rises, drifts toward the rafters, and seeps into the frozen dark. Modern listeners might call it primitive, but the pioneers didn't play for audiences. They played to remember they were still human. The sound was proof of life, a declaration whispered to the cold. Even silence afterward was part of the music. The final note stretched endlessly across the frozen landscape. When the song ends, no one claps. They just sit, feeling the warmth between them and the cold pressing in beyond the walls. The night hums softly, a shared heartbeat of flame, voice, and ice. The pioneers never thought of themselves as artists, but in their patience and their listening, they turned survival into song. The next morning dawns pale and brittle. The sun hangs low, shining on frost that looks like powdered glass. You rub your hands together and feel the sting of air that bites before it blesses. For the pioneers, such mornings were full of quiet danger. Frostbite was a constant threat, yet it was also a teacher. In every settlement, people had their own language for what the cold did to the body. Those words told stories of pain, ingenuity, and stubborn endurance. In the letters of a Dakota Territory nurse from 1868, she wrote that the cold has a personality. She meant that frostbite moved differently depending on the day. Sometimes it arrived like a thief, silent and fast, taking toes before you felt the warning. Other times it crept slowly, numbing fingers until they turned white as candles. She learned to recognize its stages just by looking at the color of skin. When the pink leaves, she wrote, the danger begins. Pioneers built a vocabulary around that fear. They spoke of frost nip for early numbness, iron chill for the ache that set deep in bone, and white sleep for the final stage, when exhaustion turned fatal. Words like those filled winter journals. They were not poetic invention, but survival shorthand. To name something was to control it, at least a little. One curious custom mentioned in letters from fur traders involved using snow to treat frostbite. It seems absurd now, but they believed that rubbing frost with frost coaxed blood back gently instead of shocking it with sudden warmth. Many saved their fingers that way. The practice lingered for decades before doctors confirmed it was indeed safer than plunging frozen skin into hot water. A particularly haunting note from a miner's diary tells of men warming their hands inside freshly killed animal carcasses during blizzards. The smell must have been awful, yet the warmth saved their lives. Those were the extremes of frontier medicine, part science, part desperation, and entirely human. Researchers studying 19th century survival practices found that pioneers were often more observant than they knew. They noticed, for example, that frostbite struck hardest after exertion. People who worked too fast in cold weather sweated, and when that moisture froze, it stole heat from the body. Move steady, not strong, one settler advised in a letter to his son. That phrase, half advice and half warning, captured the essence of winter wisdom. The folklore around frostbite was just as fascinating. In northern communities, people said that the frost woman walked at night, touching those who slept too far from the fire. Her mark was a pale patch on the skin that never regained color. Children were told to cover their ears so she would not whisper into them. Superstition, yes, but one with purpose. It kept them cautious. There was also tenderness in how they treated each other's injuries. A wife might warm her husband's frozen hands against her bare stomach. A mother would press her palms over a child's ears until color returned.
These moments were not only medical, they were expressions of care in the most physical form. The pioneers knew warmth best through touch. One overlooked account from a Swedish immigrant doctor describes using candle smoke to detect frostbite. He held a hand over the flame. If the smoke drifted evenly, the skin still had circulation. If it coiled strangely, the tissue was dead. He wrote of performing this test with reverence, as if reading a fragile message written on flesh. Historians continue to discuss whether the pioneers' resilience was a result of technique or sheer stubbornness. Some argue that their knowledge of the cold bordered on instinct. Others think it was simply necessity, refined through endless trial. Whatever the cause, they achieved something remarkable: survival in a world that punished carelessness instantly. You can picture them now. Men and women stepping out into white wind, their faces wrapped in scarves, eyes squinting against the glare. Frost gathers on lashes, lips stiffen, and still they move slow and deliberate. Every step is a dialogue with temperature. Every breath a negotiation. Inside the cabins, the language of frost continued. People compared injuries like war stories. Lost a nail to the river wind, someone might say. Gained it back by morning fire. They found humor in pain, because laughter itself made heat. Modern medicine uses sterile tools and measured doses. The pioneers used patience, faith, and the shared warmth of another living body. When frost-bitten fingers finally tingled again, it felt like resurrection. Pain became proof that life had returned. You sit by the imagined fire now, flexing your fingers,
imagining the ache they must have felt. The flames paint shadows on the walls, and you can almost hear their whispered jokes, their sighs of relief, their quiet prayers for the sun to rise. The pioneers did not conquer the cold, they conversed with it. Their bodies were the first instruments to play the song of frost. Each scar a note in the melody of endurance. They learned that pain was temporary, but wisdom lasted as long as the next winter wind. The night stretches longer now, and the cold has reached a kind of perfection. Every surface glitters, even the air seems to hum with stillness. You lie awake, listening to the faint hiss of frost against the window, and you start to understand why the pioneers dreamed differently in the cold. They noticed that winter changed their sleep. The chill did not just press against their bodies, it crept into their imaginations, shaping their nights into something slower, deeper, and sometimes strangely beautiful. A record from a homesteader's letter in 1871 mentions how his family slept like stones in snow. He meant the sleep was heavy, dreamless at first, then filled with sudden, vivid visions near dawn. Many settlers reported the same pattern. Long hours of darkness drew them into cycles of deep rest, interrupted by moments of quiet wakefulness.
They would sit up, feed the fire, drink water, and fall asleep again. Modern scientists might call it biphasic sleep. The pioneers simply called it winter rhythm. One woman wrote that her dreams felt cold at the edges. She claimed that the sound of snow outside entered her sleep, changing it. The same softness that covered the world crept into the mind. Even fear lost its sharpness when wrapped in frost. The cold, she said, made her remember things more gently. A curious detail appears in the diary of a trapper in the Yukon. He recorded dreaming of warmth whenever the temperature dropped below 20 degrees. Fires, sunlight, summer rivers. His subconscious built heat where his body could not. When he awoke, the dream stayed vivid enough to comfort him. He began to see sleep itself as part of his survival, a small trick of the mind to keep spirit and body aligned. Researchers studying early frontier health suggest that cold sleep affected breathing and metabolism in measurable ways. The slower heart rate, the deep rhythmic breath, these mirrored meditation. Many pioneers woke calmer, clearer, and more attuned to sound. They could hear the world before dawn, the soft shift of snow on roofs, or the faint call of an owl miles away. There was superstition, too. People said dreams that came during a deep freeze carried messages from ancestors. Some families made a ritual of sharing those dreams at breakfast. One father claimed his late brother appeared every time the temperature fell below zero, warning him when a blizzard approached. Whether coincidence or instinct, his predictions saved lives more than once. An overlooked note from a New England school teacher's journal tells of her boarding students waking in the night and whispering to each other by the dim firelight. She called it
the hour of frost talking. They would share stories, sometimes sing, before drifting back to sleep. It sounds like restlessness, but it was something gentler, an ancient rhythm we've forgotten, shaped by darkness and the hum of wood settling.
Some nights, dreams were not peaceful. Letters from Arctic explorers describe the mirror sleep, where they saw their own faces in frost-covered windows during dreams and awoke believing they'd seen ghosts. These hallucinations were born of exhaustion, hunger, and endless cold. Yet even those visions became part of folklore, teaching people to respect the line between body and spirit that winter often blurred. A curious practice from Russia's northern settlements involved sleeping with a candle burning low beside the bed. The flicker gave a sense of companionship and also kept frost from forming on faces during extreme cold. People believed that firelight warded off bad dreams. The steady rhythm of the flame mirrored the rhythm of breath, guiding them into gentler sleep. Modern psychologists might explain these patterns through hormones, melatonin, and lack of daylight. But the pioneers didn't care for theories. They knew what worked. Sleep came slower in the cold, but it ran deeper, cleaner. The body healed, the mind reset. You could feel the simplicity of it even now. If you imagine lying under heavy quilts, the world outside silent and absolute. One less documented tradition tells of dream keeping. Families would store stories from their dreams like they stored preserves in jars. Each morning, someone would recount their night's vision, and another would write it down in a small notebook. Those books became family treasures, half memory, half prophecy. You can see the scene. A mother sitting near the hearth, steam rising from a cup of chicory, children huddled under blankets, all listening as their father recounts a dream about summer grass or lost friends returning. The cold made such moments sacred. Dream and waking blurred into one long conversation with the world.
Historians today wonder whether the pioneers' profound relationship with sleep came from hardship or harmony. Perhaps both. They worked in daylight and rested when darkness insisted. They surrendered to the earth's rhythm rather than resisting it. Their nights were long, but they were not lonely. The crackle of embers, the sigh of wind, the slow breathing of loved ones nearby all became part of the same vast lullaby. You turn over in that imagined bed, feeling the quilt's weight and the cold air on your face. Sleep settles over you like snow, layer upon layer, until even thought slows. In that stillness, you realize what the pioneers learned long ago. The cold does not steal rest, it deepens it, wrapping each dream in quiet, so complete that waking
feels like stepping back into a smaller world. The cold morning feels like polished glass, sharp and clear. Far away, the surface of a frozen pond flashes with sunlight, and you can almost hear the faint crack of ice shifting under its own weight. For the pioneers, that sound was not just a warning of danger. It was the heartbeat of a global trade, one of the strangest industries in history, the ice trade, a time when people carved winter itself into blocks and sent it sailing across the world. An 1842 shipping record from Massachusetts lists hundreds of tons of ice loaded onto wooden ships bound for the Caribbean and India. Men cut blocks from frozen ponds using saws and horses, each slab gleaming like blue glass. They wrapped them in sawdust, packed them into cargo holds, and trusted that enough would survive the journey to turn a profit. The very idea seems impossible now, selling something that melts. But to the pioneers, it was as ordinary as any harvest. A newspaper from that era described the process in loving detail. The air smells of pine, and every stroke of the saw rings like music, one writer observed. Ice harvests were community events. Children watched, women brewed hot cider for workers, and men moved in careful rhythm. The sound of saws and cracking ice filled the valleys like a strange winter orchestra. One curious account from a Boston merchant's diary recalls that customers in Havana and Calcutta called ice the American miracle.
They used it to chill drinks, preserve fruit, and cool hospital rooms. The blocks traveled thousands of miles through tropical heat and still arrived intact, protected by their own slow melting. That journey turned frozen ponds into fortunes. Modern economists still debate how the trade succeeded for so long without modern refrigeration. The secret lay in meticulous timing and sheer audacity. The ice was cut thick during the coldest weeks of February, stored in insulated warehouses, and shipped by night whenever possible. Whole industries grew from this strange export. Carpenters built insulated crates, sailors learned to handle cold cargo. Even poets wrote about the irony of frost arriving in lands that had never seen snow. A lesser-known story tells of farmers who sold ice not for money, but for gratitude. They provided it freely to towns where summer fever struck, believing cold air itself could calm the sick. Doctors noticed that patients in shaded, cool rooms often recovered faster. The practice quietly influenced early ideas of temperature control in medicine. One remarkable letter from a young woman in Calcutta in 1853 describes holding a cube of ice in her hand for the first time. "It burns, and yet I cannot let go," she wrote. The sensation of cold became a symbol of luxury and science combined. For her, that melting fragment carried the touch of another continent. Back in the pioneer settlements, the leftover shards of ice harvests were precious. Families stored them in sawdust pits, slicing off small pieces to cool milk or soothe fevers during summer. Those same pits became meeting places in the heat of July, where neighbors gathered just to feel a hint of winter air. The scent of damp wood and melting frost lingered like memory. Historians who study this trade point out that it linked distant lives in intimate ways. The same pond that mirrored a farmer's breath in January might 6 months later cool a stranger's drink in Bombay. Ice became the first truly global comfort, a gift of cold carried by human determination. A curious domestic adaptation followed. Ice boxes, small wooden chests lined with tin and filled with blocks from the harvest. For the first time, ordinary people could store milk, butter, and meat without fear of spoilage. Kitchens changed. Recipes changed. Even the rhythm of daily meals shifted. What began as frozen pond water ended up reshaping how civilization ate. Of course, the work was brutal. Men fell through ice, lost limbs, and sometimes their lives. One old laborer described his job as working with ghosts, because every reflection on the ice showed the face of a man already half in danger. Yet the pride was immense. They were harnessing a force few dared to touch. An overlooked report from a Maine warehouse notes that by midsummer, melted ice created its own strange sound, a slow drip echoing through dark wooden corridors. Workers called it the weeping of winter.
The phrase captures both melancholy and wonder, a sense that something ephemeral had been captured, if only for a while. Imagine standing on the edge of that pond now, watching men in heavy coats drag shining slabs onto sleds. Their breath forms clouds, their boots thump in rhythm, the horses snort and steam. The world feels vast and quiet, except for the sound of ice breaking and laughter carried across the frozen air. The pioneers did not think of themselves as part of global commerce. They were simply keeping busy, turning necessity into livelihood. But what they built was extraordinary. A bridge between seasons, between nations, between warmth and cold. When night comes, the last of the ice glimmers faintly under moonlight. You picture it beginning its long voyage, silent in the hold of a ship, bound for a place where no frost will ever fall. And in that image, you sense what the pioneers knew so well. Even the cold can travel, carrying a piece of one world into another, teaching faraway people to marvel at the simple miracle of touch made cold by the hands of strangers. The fire has burned low, and the night feels intimate. You sit close to the faint glow, wrapped in a blanket that smells faintly of smoke and lanolin. Outside, the cold presses hard against the walls, but inside there is a different kind of warmth. The pioneers called it heart heat, the quiet glow that came not from firewood, but from company. In those long winters, when snow turned roads into silence and light faded by mid-afternoon, the human need for closeness became the most reliable source of warmth. A diary from a young woman in Wisconsin in 1852 describes the small rituals of affection that kept her family alive through the dark season. "We share blankets as we share prayers," she wrote. "If we sit together, the room stays kind." That phrase captures a truth modern life forgets. Warmth multiplies when it is shared.
Researchers studying family life in the 19th century have found that cold weather shaped domestic relationships more than any other factor. Space was scarce and privacy almost impossible. Families slept side by side, ate elbow to elbow, and learned to read each other's silences. Frustration flared quickly, but so did tenderness.
Many letters from that time mention how winter softened even the hardest personalities. People forgave more easily when the night outside howled. One curious account from a widowed farmer notes that his neighbors made a point to visit him every few nights through the worst cold. They brought food, chopped wood, and sat by the fire without speaking much. "Their presence keeps me," he wrote. That kind of wordless companionship was considered essential. Loneliness could be as deadly as frostbite. In many settlements, friendship was built through literal heat. Neighbors shared hearths, gathered in one cabin when storms grew severe, and took turns tending each other's fires. A good host was praised for the steadiness of his chimney smoke, a sign that others could depend on his flame if theirs failed. In such a world, kindness was measured in degrees. There was also a quiet intimacy between couples shaped by necessity. One letter from a frontier wife in Iowa describes lying awake in the dark, her husband's hand resting on her back to keep both warm. "We do not speak," she wrote, "for even words take breath we should keep." Their love was simple and bodily, an act of shared endurance. A lesser-known custom from Scandinavian settlers tells of sleeping in heat trains. Whole families arranged themselves head to toe beneath long quilts, each body a link in a living chain of warmth. Children in the middle, elders at the edges, everyone breathing in rhythm. It sounds uncomfortable to modern ears, yet to them it was comfort itself. Historians who study these customs note that emotional connection became a tool for survival. Quarrels paused in winter because cooperation mattered more than pride. Small gestures, passing a cup of broth, tucking a blanket over another's shoulders, were ways of saying, "I choose your life over my irritation." Survival refined affection into something practical and sacred. A curious footnote in a missionary's diary mentions warming feasts, gatherings where families shared hot food simply to lift each other's spirits. The menu was modest: bread, boiled potatoes, perhaps a stew, but laughter counted as nourishment too.
"Joy cooks faster than fire," he wrote, half in jest, half in awe. In the coldest regions, even animals joined the circle. Dogs slept near the hearth, cats burrowed under quilts, and chickens sometimes huddled in corners of the house. The boundaries between species softened. Every warm body was a blessing. Children learned early to be gentle because warmth depended on harmony. Modern psychologists might call it emotional resilience. The pioneers didn't name it at all. They simply practiced it, weaving compassion into the fabric of survival. When one person fell ill, others filled the gap without complaint.
When grief came, they sat in silence until the storm inside matched the one outside, both eventually quieting together. You can almost see it now, a family gathered close as the wind moans beyond the door, faces lit by firelight, hands clasped without ceremony. There are no grand speeches, no promises, just presence. The kind of love that doesn't need to be said because it's felt in every shared breath. An overlooked letter from a prairie school teacher ends with a line that feels timeless. "Our houses are cold," she wrote, "but our hearts learn the pattern of flame." She was right. The pioneers built their warmth out of proximity, not perfection. They learned that to keep each other close was to keep the night from winning. You sit there in your imagination, surrounded by that steady warmth of human closeness. The air hums softly with the sound of breathing, the rustle of blankets, the small sigh of contentment. Outside, the cold prowls like a patient animal waiting. Inside, love holds steady, invisible yet powerful, glowing from skin and voice and shared heartbeat. The pioneers called it the kindest fire of all. The wind outside has changed. It no longer sounds like a living thing, but like memory itself moving across the land. You sit at the edge of the light, listening to the house breathe, and it hits you that something precious has gone quiet in modern life. The pioneers once carried a kind of cold literacy, a fluent awareness of air, frost, and silence. They could read the world through touch and sound.
Somewhere along the way, that language faded. In a notebook written by a Vermont farmer in 1889, there is a short line that feels almost prophetic. "When we stop hearing the frost, we will stop knowing when to listen." He could not have guessed how right he was. For the pioneers, the ability to feel weather in the bones, to sense the hour by the smell of the air, was not superstition. It was education taught by necessity. Today, that sensitivity would be called primitive, yet it was a sophistication of its own kind. People recognized 50 shades of cold: air that pinched, air that hummed, air that lay heavy like wool. They knew the difference between a still night before snow and a silence born from deep freeze. The world spoke constantly to them, and they answered by tending, mending, and respecting. One curious entry from a Midwestern homesteader's diary recalls teaching her children how to hear frost grow. She told them to sit quietly at dawn to listen for the faint ticking sound on the window pane as ice crystals spread. "The sound means you have one more hour before the sun wakes," she wrote. It was not science, but it was true. Anyone who has lived near deep cold knows the small crystalline creak of expanding frost. A scholar of environmental history once noted that pioneers measured wealth not in goods, but in readiness. The more someone could interpret the weather, the safer their household. A well-stocked firewood pile mattered less than knowing when to add to it. That balance of observation and humility was the invisible architecture of survival. A curious household trick mentioned in several letters was the listening nail. Families drove a single long nail into the cabin wall and used it as a crude thermometer. On nights when frost deepened, the wood around the nail contracted, creating a faint ringing sound. If the nails sang early, they added wood to the fire. If it stayed silent, they slept. The walls themselves became instruments. Modern life has made that awareness obsolete. Machines now do the listening for us.
We depend on sensors and forecasts, forgetting that once the human body itself was an instrument of perception. The pioneers knew when to seal doors by watching candle flames, when to open windows by how fast bread rose.
They felt changed through fingertips and breath. Historians who study sensory culture argue that this knowledge was not lost suddenly, but eroded slowly, replaced by comfort. When light became electric and heat constant, there was no need to listen to the world anymore. But comfort carries a cost. We forget that stillness can teach. One lesser-known letter from a Norwegian immigrant laments this loss even in her own time. She wrote to her sister back home, "My children do not know the sound of frost or the taste of snow from a new roof. They grow in warmth and know little." Her sadness was not nostalgia, but warning. To her, disconnection from the cold was disconnection from reality itself. You can imagine that now. A person standing inside a perfectly sealed home, windows fogged but untouchable, the air conditioned and flavorless, no scent of wood smoke, no bite of air to wake the lungs. The seasons blur together and time feels thinner. The very discomfort that once made life vivid has been erased. One overlooked essay by a 19th century philosopher claimed that cold teaches honesty because it demands presence. "You cannot be distracted in the cold," he wrote. "You must feel or perish." That discipline shaped the pioneers into attentive beings. They lived with eyes open, listening even when silence was all there was. Imagine them now, walking into the wind, their faces raw and bright. Every breath stings, yet every breath reminds them they belong to this place. They do not check numbers on a screen. They trust their skin, their instincts, their memory of what cold should feel like. Perhaps that is what we have forgotten most. Not the techniques or the tools, but the relationship. Cold was not something to avoid, but something to know, to negotiate with, to respect. The pioneers read it like scripture, written in frost and wind. When they stepped outside each morning, they entered a conversation. As you sit in this quiet moment, the thought lingers. Maybe progress has made life warmer, but in the process, it has made it smaller. The pioneers would shake their heads at how much we fear discomfort. They would remind us that to feel cold is to feel alive, and that the air still speaks if we would only remember how to listen. Morning breaks slowly, gray before gold, the kind of light that feels soft against the snow. The fire has gone to embers, glowing faintly in the hearth.
You stretch, your breath visible in the air, and for a moment the world seems to hold its own breath with you. The pioneers would have recognized this stillness. It was the quiet hour, when everything stood between endings and beginnings, when frost glimmered like memory and warmth waited to be rebuilt. One entry from an 1882 family diary calls this hour the promise time. The writer describes watching the first sun hit the ice on the river, turning it into glass. "The cold forgives the night," she wrote, "and the day forgives the cold." That gentle acceptance sums up the wisdom that generations once carried. That cold was not an enemy, only a test. A little-known farm manual from that century lists rules for surviving winter that read almost like poetry. Keep your fire alive. Trust the frost to tell you when to work and when to rest. Let silence teach you its shape. Share heat freely. Prepare early and sleep deeply. Each line, simple as it sounds, holds the weight of centuries of human trial. The pioneers never sought to conquer winter. They lived inside it, adjusting their habits, thoughts, and even emotions to its rhythm. Modern historians call this adaptation. The people who lived it called it faith. They believed that every season carried lessons meant to be learned again and again. In one letter, a woman who crossed the plains wrote to her sister, "When the cold speaks kindly, listen. It asks you only to slow down." That advice feels timeless. The cold slowed the world enough for them to see what mattered. The breath of a horse, the shimmer of frost on a window, the weight of another hand in the dark. A curious note in a preacher's journal records that he thanked God for frost each year because it made men humble and women wise. The phrase sounds quaint but hides deep truth. Humility and wisdom were the currency of survival. The pioneers did not think themselves masters of nature, but partners in a difficult dance. Modern observers often imagine those winters as bleak, yet the diaries, letters, and songs tell a different story. They speak of laughter echoing through snow, of bread baking beside slow fires, of families falling asleep under heavy quilts, feeling safe in their small circles of light. The cold sharpened gratitude until it glowed. You imagine now that same gratitude filling a cabin. A woman pours coffee made from roasted barley, its aroma thick and comforting. A man checks the roof for ice. A child rubs frost off the window with her mitten, tracing the sunrise in the glass. Their world is small, but it is whole. Every detail has purpose. An overlooked note from a Norwegian homesteader says, "Cold keeps us honest. It gives back what we give it." He meant that the effort spent chopping wood, mending clothes, or tending the fire was repaid in warmth, but only just enough. It was a kind of divine accounting, exact, fair, and never sentimental. Historians today argue over whether modern humanity could ever relearn that patience. Perhaps we could, but it would require a quieter heart. The pioneers lived in a slow tempo where every choice, how to light a fire, how to store apples, when to trust the snow, was made with care. We live quickly, mistaking speed for safety. Yet, gold has not changed. It waits, patient as ever, ready to teach anyone willing to listen again. You stand at that imagined doorway, frost shimmering around the frame, and look out. The horizon is white and endless. The cold breathes across your face, sharp but clean, and in it you hear every lesson whispered by those who came before you. Respect the chill. Trust your senses. Keep your fire small and steady. Share warmth. Listen. The pioneers understood cold not as punishment, but as invitation. It taught them to see clearly, to move gently, to care for each other fiercely. In their world, warmth was not a possession, but
but a practice. Perhaps if we learn to feel the air again, we might recover that wisdom. That comfort means nothing without awareness, and endurance means everything when it is shared. You take one more deep breath. The frost glows faintly in the window light, and the silence hums with peace. The fire stirs, the house stretches, the day begins. Now the story quiets. The air inside your mind feels slower, as if the frost itself has melted into calm. The pioneers fade gently into the distance, their fires still glowing somewhere beyond the snow. You imagine their warmth drifting forward through time, carried in every cup of tea, every blanket, every soft winter morning. When the world feels still enough to listen, let the last of their lessons settle in you. Feel the air around you, cool but not cold, and your breath slow until it matches the rhythm of the imagined hearth. You have followed them through frost and silence, through fear and patience, and now you stand in a place of stillness that is all your own. There is nothing left to fix, nothing left to learn tonight. The cold has done its work. It has polished the world until only peace remains. You can rest now, knowing that the warmth you feel belongs not only to you, but to every soul who ever faced the winter and smiled back. Sleep easily. The fire is low but faithful. The night outside is clear. The frost has forgiven the day. Sweet dreams.